Hi, it's Richard from Intelligent Advisor IT Consulting with another in our series about the example projects that are supplied with Oracle policy modeling. Um, the goal of this series, as you know, is to first of all explain a little bit about how to use them, but also to give you some ideas for how to make changes or make additions to them. First of all, for learning purposes, of course, because they're excellent places to start, but also if you are faced with a need to customize it in some way because you want to demonstrate it to a colleague or a friend or who knows, a future customer, and you're looking for ways to do this. This time round, we'll be looking at the copyright permissions sample. So I'm going to go ahead and click Example Projects and choose Copyright Permissions. Now I've been playing around with this project a few times, so of course I get this message. I'm going to go ahead now and completely replace my messed up version with the fresh version. Remember, this is not a download. These are actually installed when you installed Oracle Policy Modeling, so you can do this when you're offline as well. So the Copyright Permissions project essentially is a advisor project where you answer questions about using written or recorded material that belongs to somebody else. So, let's imagine that you're writing a magazine article and you want to include some text from somebody else's book, or you want to include some material from some other format. The question is, do you need permission because of copyright? Whose copyright is it, and is copyright in place, or is it an old book? So you don't need to contact the author. Is the author alive? And all those sort of questions. In the example project, you'll see on the front page, which isn't typically shown in the interview because it has no data inputs, it just reminds you that this is based on some Australian Copyright Council documentation. And you'll see here in the first screen that there's actually a link to something called the Introduction to Copyright in Australia. This link, and indeed another link that was used, has changed. So one thing you could do, of course, is simply demonstrate how easy it is to change that value. There it is here. So that's the current value as of the 18th of February 2022. There's a recommended demonstration path, which basically tells you that when you run the interview in the debugger, or if you've chosen to deploy it and you want to run it as an interview straight up from your hub, the idea is that you would run it through with the standard default answers and walk your way through. You'll notice that some questions have been pre-marked as checked. You'll notice that substitution is used so that the name that you entered appears in almost every question, which is really very cool. So you can demonstrate that because when you go to the actual interview screens, of course, you don't see the name Richard. It's not hard-coded. And when you walk your way through all of these standard questions, you reach the end page, which says you might not need copyright permission, and you can display the drop downs of the explanation. And as you can see, there's another download page here. And if we go to that outcome page here, so this is another web page that you might consider changing to a more up-to-date version. The website is the same address, it's no longer ASPX files, it's no longer a Microsoft website, it appears to be running under Tomcat now, so the addresses have changed a little bit. And as you can see on the final page, this is a similar routine to the previous example that we looked at last week, which was all about business licenses. There's a variety of recommendations which are displayed based on some visibility rules, whether depending on what answers you've given. Options for modification, or should we say enhancement, I think there are a couple that you can do very quickly to impress on people how easy it is to use Oracle Policy Modeling to create good screen layouts, The first one will be that you can see here that a lot of these screens are very linear, are very vertical. So there's nothing wrong with that, but what we could do, of course, is we could position ourselves and create a container. You may remember that using containers, so I'll put another container inside that container. In fact, I'll put two containers inside that container. So we have a hierarchical container set here. Then we can play around with adding these items to the containers, and we can produce a little more sophisticated layout. I'm not suggesting this is the layout that you'd necessarily want, but the point being is that it's very easy to create fairly sophisticated column or other layouts without being an HTML person at all. And of course, that's a major selling point. So there you can see that I have a semi columnar layout. I'm going to stretch this a little bit. And now I have something that I think is pretty close to a basic column layout. Um, I don't need to be a HTML expert to do that. The other things that I think we can look at quickly changing if we take a look at some of this is the entire interview. If we look at the data tab, there's essentially two concepts here. There's a lot of questions that we ask about the materials that you intend to use. But right at the beginning, there's a question about, who is the person who is intending to use the material? So if this was me who was writing the article, this is where I'd write my name, and I'd give my gender, and I'd give some basic information. Um, so at the moment, in this interview, there is one person. So what happens if, for the purposes of a demonstration, you'd like to easily demonstrate how quick and fun it is to use the concept of an entity to be able to collect information from multiple people? Now, I grant you that you might not want to do this in the copyright permission scenario, but it's a fascinating demo to do, and it hits quite hard in terms of people realize just how powerful Oracle Policy Modeling and Oracle Intelligent Advisor is. But before we get on to that, the other thing that you will probably want to demonstrate out of the Copyright Permissions project is the fact that you have test cases included in the example. So if you've never used test cases, you can take a few moments to learn how to do it, but it's essentially a Excel-based format for creating test scenarios. I've opened it up, and as you can see, there are 15 test cases provided, and each one of them, if I scroll across to the left, there you are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, is essentially a set of answers to the input data. So these are essentially providing pre-filled answers to the input data, and also on the other side, providing both expected outcomes and actual outcomes, so that if you have expected outcomes and you don't get the answer that you're expecting, this would be, for example, a regression test that went wrong because, well, the interview or the rule engine is behaving differently than it was before. So this in itself is very powerful and be able to demonstrate it. So I recommend that you do that. But also, if you're going to use that, you also have the ability to showcase the fact that you can also run them from here. And when you run them from here, not only, of course, does it test all 15 scenarios, but you also get some execution data, and you can open up a log directory. And in that log directory, if I can wait a few moments for a log, you will see a execution timing data in that CSV file. And in the parent directory, you'll find another one called test performance. So you'll be able to identify, I'm going to attempt to open this in Notepad rather than Excel, because Excel doesn't seem to work very well. Well, I've opened it in Excel anyway, so um, you can probably see here that each line is one of the attributes within the project, the name of the Word document, and the number of microseconds that were used to execute it. So you can begin to identify attributes that take a proportion of your execution time. So if you are someone who's just applied major changes to your project and you notice that these numbers are changing in a good or a bad way, you have an idea of the impact of the changes that you made. You can find plenty about that in the documentation, but it's an excellent one to demonstrate. So now let's talk about this concept of how here at the moment in this project there's only one person at a time who can get advice. And the entire interview is based around the idea that there will be only one person. Well, what happens if in any rule engine you now realize that you might want to have multiple people? Perhaps you were looking at one person, now you want to deal with multiple members of the same family. Well, this is a great place to do this demo. So you select the global entity. And the reason this is a good place to do the demo is that so many of the attributes are actually using a formulation that makes it easy to switch into an entity. I'm going to create an entity called the person. So it's going to try to create an entity called the person, and you'll see that the attribute says the new entity. There will be a couple of things we need to tidy up, but let's just go ahead and create that entity. So there will be a warning message, or rather an error message, saying that something couldn't be renamed. That doesn't matter for now. Let's just click OK. So now we have the person, so the entity called the person as existing. There's that trace of the work that I just did a moment ago called the new entity, which has appeared in global. You can go ahead and delete that. So now we have the person, and you'll notice that all of the attributes that started with the words the person, or that include the person in the attribute text, have been shifted into this entity. So now we have the concept of being able to have multiple people. And we now have this relationship called all instances of the person. I'm going to change this to the people because that's how you talk about people. You don't tend to say all the instances of the person in real life. So now we have a containment relationship and we have an entity called the person. Of course, there are a couple of things that we now need to do. We'll see, and this is horrifying when you first see it. There's 13 different errors in your interview, but that's because of the things that we've just done. So the first thing I would recommend you do is you go to the final page here, which is where we have all the output relating to the person needing copyright material. This needs to change because, of course, there could be multiple people. So that's really easy to do. You add a control called an entity container, and you add the person, which gives you the possibility of essentially displaying this information for multiple people. And you then drag and drop each one of those little pieces of information from where they are into, or rather underneath, the person. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. It's a little clumsy when I do it online here with a camera in front of me, but it's not hard to do. And each time I move one, you'll notice that the number of errors is going down because I'm solving the issue. I'm putting these attributes underneath the person entity so that it will be displayed. If I have two people, I will see these twice because, of course, there will be recommendations per person. Oh, missed that last one. There we go. So already we've got down to the point now where there's only one error. The other error concerns an attribute displayed on this page, and this is regarding the material's first publication. And there's a visibility rule that says if the material the person proposes has to use is true, and that's simply a case that these two attributes are currently listed under the global attribute. I'm going to switch them to the person attribute. And now all of the questions are underneath the person. There are no issues on the interview and there are no issues on the rules. There are a couple of other things that we will need to do. For example, in the initial part of the interview, we ask you for the name of the person. Well, of course, what happens if there are multiple people? We're going to ask you for how to input multiple people. So I'm going to go to the new input button and I'm going to add an input for the people. Again, we'll get a whole stack of errors because now the information underneath needs to be dropped into the person, just like we did on the last screen. So now we have the ability to add multiple persons. And while we're here, there are a couple of other things we can do to enhance the demo. First of all, I would say that this is a particularly unattractive layout. You might want to select this input and choose Tabular Mode, which gives you a tabbed layout. So you can then choose to adjust the headers so that the labels and headers make a bit more sense. So I'll say, does this person hold a license? Propose to use the material. Well, that'll do for now, I think. Well, I think that'll do for now. And that means that we can add new people. So let's say add new person. Of course, it helps if you spell it right. So now we have the ability to add multiple people and fill in the initial details for each of the persons, or each of the people, sorry. So we could now try and run that. Didn't take us very long. I've created a new session. I'll reset it so we come back to the beginning, and you can see that I'm required to add one or more people. So I'm going to go ahead and add a couple of people. We'll say no to this, and we'll do this. Yes. And now we'll go through the materials. You can see that Richard is being prompted to answer questions. And these are all questions for Richard. Still for Richard. Still for Richard. You can see the substitution here. And now we switch over to the second person. And the questions come round for the second person. And we'll answer slightly differently. And as you can see, we now have different recommendations for Richard and for Anna. Although the outcome is the same, the links that are provided are different. So this is a great way to demonstrate how you can use an entity to handle multiple people getting advice from the same rule base, from the same project. As well as these modifications, there are, of course, now other modifications that you will essentially need to make in respect of the test cases, because the test cases were built originally for the model as it was provided. Before we go and change the test cases, we're going to go back to the Data tab and double-click the new entity, just to make sure that the entity has an identifying attribute. Every entity needs an identifying attribute. What is the basic single piece of information that identifies the person? And there is already an attribute in this model called the person, which actually corresponds to the name Richard or Anna. So make sure that you add this as the identifying attribute. And then you can go to the project and we can open up our test case file, which of course, not surprisingly, will no longer work in its current state because this no longer reflects the structure of the interview. So if I click run, you might think, well, what's going to happen now? Yeah, you get a bunch of errors because obviously the structure is different. To demonstrate how easy it is to alter the structure to handle our new entity, we will go up to the toolbar here and click Add Entity, surprise, surprise, and we'll add the entity called the person. So now we have a blank sheet ready for the person. And what we'll do is we'll take all of this, which was originally in global, and we'll take all of these and we'll take them into, except for the last column, we'll cut it out and we'll paste it in to here. So now we have a very large list of data within the person. The way this list is structured is a little confusing at first. So what you might like to do is drag it around until you can find the column relating to the person's name. That might help you. So you can see here we have this column called the person. So we could cut that and just paste it in here, frankly, because it's going to make it easier to understand if we realize that we're dealing with different people. And if we haven't already done so, just to make sure that we've... Now, of course, we'll have to stretch this down to hook this up to the test cases. So now we have a bunch of people and they're available in all of the test cases, and these are all the answers relating to these people. I'll go over to the test cases tab now, and I'll basically cut the area that I am. There we go. So test case number 1, and we have this column called the people. So basically we can now decide which persons are used for which test case. So I'm going to take, for example, Glenda and Harry and say, well, that test case number 1, we're going to use Glenda and Harry. And I can either run the test case, or what I'm more likely to do for my demonstration is I can actually just select the test case and hit debug. And the Oracle Policy Modeling debugger will be opened. And the data that have been loaded in are Glenda and Harry. And the details of the interview are, of course, based on Glenda and Harry. So it's a great way for you to, first of all, go through multiple scenarios, choosing multiple people. I'm going to choose Glenda and Yolanda. And I guess you can see where this is going. We can build further scenarios since you have 15 people. That makes for a lot of combinations of different people. So you can easily demonstrate how fun it is to create test cases and how you can use the test case to handle the fact that now you have multiple persons. You could even have three, of course. So we could have Glenda, Harry, and Greg here. Or you could have them all, of course, which would be a bit of overkill. But so I could then hit the debug button, and now I have three of them. So yeah, this I think is a very good demonstration of, first of all, the ability to, in a project, handle the concept of an entity. Secondly, see how an existing project has been switched from a global to an entity focus. Then also how to adjust the user interface, and also in this case, how to take advantage of test cases, and even how to modify the test case to take into account our new structure. So that just about wraps it up for our little whistle-stop demo of the copyright permissions project, and also for suggested ways to demonstrate the flexibility of Oracle policy modeling and demonstrate the ability of the entity modeling concepts. Hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon for the next one.